The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical hymn as Megan O'Brien folded the 15th bandage of her shift, her hands moving with the precision of someone who'd learned hospital corners in a different life. The cotton squares bent at perfect 90-degree angles, crease, fold, overlap, smooth, movements so economical and exact that her fellow nurses had stopped asking her to teach them years ago. Something about the efficiency made them uncomfortable. Dr. Mercer watched from the nurse's station, his Italian shoes propped against the desk, his calculating gaze tracking her movements like a predator assessing a rival's position in the pack. He'd been at Seattle General for 4 years, long enough to build a reputation for excellence and short enough that no one had begun investigating the phantom equipment charges, $847,000 in marked-up surgical kits that never quite materialized, inflated procedure codes that funded his lake house in the hill country. The lake house had cost him $1.2 million, and he'd financed exactly half of it through the careful manipulation of Seattle General's billing protocols. But this nurse with the unreadable face and the steady hands, the one who moved like she was trained for something far beyond civilian hospital work, made that calculus nervous. She noticed things. Small things. A missing invoice, a mislabeled tray, a procedure billed twice on the same day. Not loudly. Not in front of witnesses. Just the way her jaw would tighten for exactly one breath before she returned to her work, as if cataloging details that might prove useful later. Megan moved through the cardiac unit with a gait that favored her left leg slightly, a limp she'd never explained to anyone at Seattle General, just as she'd never explained the scars that mapped across her knuckles like a topographical survey of violence survived. Her badge clattered softly against her sternum as she approached room 507, where the mute veteran from Helmand Province lay waiting for his morning for dressing change. His name was Marcus Webb, a Special Forces soldier whose larynx had been obliterated by shrapnel 3 years ago, leaving him with nothing but a whisper that sounded like wind through a canyon, hollow, ghostly, barely registering as human sound. He'd been transferred to Seattle General's cardiac unit because the trauma ward had no more beds and because dying hearts didn't discriminate based on how you'd earned your wounds. Megan entered the room without knocking, a violation of protocol that no one had ever corrected her on because somehow it never felt invasive when she did it. Her hands were already moving, prepping the site with chlorhexidine solution, the acrid smell of antiseptic rising between them like a curtain, before Marcus even registered her presence. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was full of recognition, two people fluent in the language of necessary quiet. When she threaded the 18-gauge for catheter into his left antecubital fossa with a single fluid motion, Marcus's breathing didn't change, didn't quicken with anticipatory dread the way it did with other nurses. His eyes tracked her with a precision that suggested he was reading muscle memory in her movements, the way a musician recognizes another musician's training just from how they hold their instrument. She hadn't trembled. Hadn't paused. The needle had gone in on the first attempt, the kind of technical perfection that takes either hundreds of repetitions on training arms or the kind of embedded muscle memory that comes from doing it under fire. Marcus's eyes narrowed slightly, not in pain, but in understanding. When she secured the line with sterile tape and stepped back, he was still watching her, his damaged throat making that wind canyon sound again, something between a breath and a word that never quite finished being born. She adjusted his bag, checked the drip rate, 18 milliliters per hour, precisely as ordered, and moved toward the door. Behind her, Marcus's hand rose slightly, not enough to be a gesture, just enough to exist. She paused. 1 second. 2. Then returned to the cardiac unit without acknowledging it, because acknowledgement would require explanation, and explanation was the one thing she couldn't afford. The break room cleared within seconds of her arrival. She'd learned to recognize the pattern, the way conversations died mid-sentence, the sudden urgency that materialized to pull nurses toward phantom tasks, the practiced efficiency of abandonment. Today it was Rodriguez and Chen who left first, their thermoses collected in a synchronized movement that might have been choreographed. Then Morrison, who actually did mutter something about supply inventory that nobody believed. The fluorescent lights in the break room hummed their tired song, and Megan sat alone with the mechanical breathing of the vending machine, the motor cycling every 45 seconds with metronomic precision. The smell of burnt coffee lingered in the air, Someone had made a fresh pot at 6 in the morning and left it running past its tolerance for neglect. She didn't eat. She rarely did during shifts. Instead, she reached into her scrub pocket and retrieved the folded piece of paper she checked once per rotation, a habit so established it had become unconscious, like checking a pulse. The unit patch was safely hidden where it had been for 7 years, sewn into the lining of the faded jacket in her locker, green cloth the color of terrain and memory, embroidered with insignia that no one at Seattle General would couldn't recognize, because the unit no longer officially existed in the way it had when she'd earned the right to wear it. She'd touched it this morning, as she did every morning, a ritual so small that it barely qualified as ritual. Just fingers against cloth, just acknowledgement, just the word silent inside her skull, still here, still breathing, still alive. Dr. Mercer's voice carried down the hallway, that affected tone he used during rounds, the one that suggested expertise while concealing a fundamental lack of genuine knowledge. She could hear him in room 509, explaining a medication interaction to Mrs. Patterson with the confidence of someone who'd looked it up on his phone 30 seconds before entering the room. The medication interaction was wrong, by the way. He'd confused the effect of simvastatin on metoprolol metabolism, but Mrs. Patterson wouldn't know that, and the attending wouldn't contradict him in front of a patient. Megan knew the actual interaction because she'd learned it at Fort Bragg during a field medicine rotation, absorbed it into muscle memory the way some people learn nothing at all. She returned to the unit floor 15 minutes early, because staying in the break room 1 second longer than necessary felt like asking to be noticed, and being noticed was the one thing she couldn't afford anymore. The unit board got updated at 2:44 p.m. Megan saw her name appear in red marker, the same red used for critical alerts, for urgent interventions, for the things that required immediate attention. Disciplinary actions pending. The letters were precise, the handwriting aggressive of Mercer's script, definitely. She stared at it for exactly 3 seconds, letting her eyes track each letter, filing the aesthetic details away in the same way a sniper files wind direction and ammunition weight. 2 nurses stood nearby, pretending not to watch, their body language screaming rehearsed casualness. Whatever had prompted this, they'd been briefed on it, which meant it was strategic, which meant it was going to escalate beyond the simple humiliation of public posting. Mercer was moving into stage 2 of his escalation plan, the stages that required coordination, that required witnesses, that required building a consensus around her incompetence or untrustworthiness. She'd seen this before in a different context, in a different life, the way power-hungry men built cases against threats, gathering documentation like forensic evidence. She didn't lower her eyes to the board. She didn't let her jaw tighten. Instead, she turned and walked directly toward patient rooms, her limp barely perceptible, her hands already occupied with the next task. Because showing nothing was a kind of resistance. Because staying silent was a weapon that no one had ever learned to counter. Because she'd been trained by the 75th Ranger Regiment to function under extreme psychological pressure, and a red marker on a hospital board didn't even register as the faintest whisper of threat. The afternoon stretched into evening, and by the time her shift ended, Megan had logged 17 patient interactions, changed 8 for dressings, and filed away the 17 separate moments where staff members had gone quiet in her presence. Marcus Webb in room 507 was asleep by then, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical rhythm of a body finally convinced it might survive another night. She paused at his door for 1 second, not enough time to qualify as lingering, just enough time to confirm the steady green blip of his cardiac monitor. His hand rested on top of the blanket, the 4 lines secured, the vital signs stable. She didn't know why she cared more about his stability than any other patient's. She didn't let herself ask the question. Instead, she returned her scrubs to the laundry at the hospital's north entrance, folding them with hospital corners the way she always did, placing them in the bin for the overnight cleaning cycle. As she walked toward the parking lot, she kept her posture neutral and her breathing measured and her face arranged in the expression of a tired nurse finishing a difficult shift, nothing more threatening than that, nothing that would prompt anyone to look twice. The evening was cooling as she reached her vehicle, and somewhere in the distance, rain threatened the horizon like a promise that never quite materialized. The evening was cooling as she reached her vehicle, and somewhere in the distance, rain threatened the horizon like a promise that never quite materialized. Megan sat in the parking lot for exactly 4 minutes, hands on the steering wheel, breathing measured and deliberate. The shift had 12 more hours remaining on the schedule before her break. She started the engine and drove back toward the hospital entrance, pulling into the staff lot rather than leaving. Some nights required being present before they demanded it. By 7:15 the next morning, she was already at her locker when Dr. Mercer arrived on the unit. He moved through the hallway with the confidence of a man who had never been questioned, his white coat pressed sharp enough to cut, his stethoscope draped like a decoration rather than a tool. He'd spent the evening on his boat, she could smell the lake water on his jacket, and he'd spent the night calculating how to tighten the noose. Megan had worked 3 of his patients overnight. He would find something. He always did. Room for 12 held Mr. Kowalski, a post-operative cardiac bypass patient exactly 36 hours out from surgery. His wife sat in the plastic visitor's chair, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes tracking every movement in the room like prey learning to recognize predators. Their daughter stood near the window, arms crossed, tension radiating off her shoulders in waves. Megan had been in room for 12 for 7 minutes when Dr. Mercer appeared in the doorway with 2 surgical residents trailing behind him like remoras following a shark. She was changing the dressing on the surgical site, a precise, methodical process she'd performed 847 times without complication. Sterile field prepared. For bifour gauze arranged in a grid. The incision clean, healing properly, no sign of infection or seroma. Her hands moved with the economy of motion that came from years of repetition, muscle memory taking over while her mind remained elsewhere, watching. Waiting. She knew what was coming. She'd seen this pattern before, in different contexts, in different buildings, but the choreography was identical. Nurse O'Brien, stop. Stop. His voice split the room like a blade. He stepped forward, his presence suddenly taking up all the available air. This is contaminated technique. Did you even attend nursing school, or did you get your license from a cereal box? He was pointing at her perfectly sterile field. The gauze arrangement was textbook. The technique flawless. But the words didn't matter. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that Mrs. Kowalski's face had gone pale, and her daughter's arms had tightened across her chest, and Mr. Kowalski's heart rate had spiked on the monitor from 62 to 78 beats per minute. Mrs. Kowalski, I sincerely apologize, Dr. Mercer said, his voice dripping with performative concern. Unfortunately, not all of our nursing staff meet the standard Seattle General expects. Nurse O'Brien here has contaminated your husband's sterile field multiple times. Multiple times. I'll need to redo this dressing myself to ensure there's no infection risk. He turned to one of the residents. Get a fresh dressing kit. Everything. And document this incident in her chart. Megan's jaw clenched once. A single muscular contraction beneath her skin, invisible unless someone was watching closely. Her hands continued their work, securing the current dressing with the same precision she'd used moments before, completing the procedure despite his monologue, her movements mechanical and perfect and utterly devoid of reaction. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at the family. She simply finished what she'd started, placed the soiled gauze in the biohazard container, and turned to leave. That will be all, Nurse O'Brien, he said, the dismissal sharp and final. She stopped at the doorway. For 3 seconds, only 3, her hand gripped the door frame. Not hard enough to leave marks. Just hard enough to feel the metal beneath her palm, cold and unyielding and real. Then she released it and walked into the hallway, her face arranged in the expression of a woman who had heard nothing, felt nothing, registered nothing at all. Behind her, Mrs. Kowalski was asking questions, her voice climbing in pitch. Mr. Kowalski's monitor alarm was drifting higher. The break room was empty when she entered at 11:47. 12 minutes of documented lunch break, all she'd allowed herself. Turkey sandwich. Black coffee. A moment to exist in a space where no one was watching. She'd made it 43 seconds into the meal when the door opened and 3 nurses entered, their voices cutting off mid-word. One of them, for Jennifer, who'd been friendly for the first 6 weeks before the social calculus had shifted, grabbed her thermos from the shelf above the sink. The others followed, moving with the coordinated efficiency of a planned retreat. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. They simply fled like birds startled from a power line, leaving her alone with the hum of the vending machine and an untouched sandwich growing cold on the paper plate in front of her. She stared at the sandwich for a full minute. Then she folded the plastic wrap around it, placed it back in her bag, and returned to the unit. The unit board was positioned directly across from the nurse's station where everyone would see it. Her name appeared in red marker, printed in block letters that screamed urgency and consequence, Megan O'Brien. Below it, in slightly smaller text, disciplinary actions pending. She studied the board for exactly 3 seconds, her eyes tracking each letter, committing the composition to memory. Then she turned away and walked toward the patient rooms. Dr. Mercer was waiting at the nurse's station. Checklist, he called out, loud enough for the 4 surgical residents and the 2 RNs charting within earshot to hear clearly. When you're done with your break, room 309 needs a bedpan. And try not to contaminate it on the way down the hallway. One of the residents actually smiled. Megan nodded once, a small, economical movement, and continued walking toward the supply closet. Behind her, she heard Dr. Mercer explaining something to the residents about standardized protocols and the importance of maintaining professional boundaries with underperforming staff members. The supply closet was 3 meters long and narrow enough that her shoulders almost touched the walls on either side. She found the bedpan on the 3rd shelf, pulled it down with one hand, and gripped the metal shelf above it with the other. Her knuckles turned white. Not from fear. From something else entirely, something that had been trained into muscle and bone and nervous system, the trembling that came not from weakness but from restraint, the physical effort required to keep her hands from doing the things her training had prepared them to do. 10 seconds. That's how long she allowed herself. 10 seconds of breathing through her nose, 10 seconds of gripping cold metal, 10 seconds of remembering that Captain Megan O'Brien of the 75th Ranger Regiment was not permitted to exist in this building. Not yet. Then she released the shelf. Her knuckles resumed their normal color. She picked up the bedpan and walked back to room 309, moving with the mechanical precision of a woman who was exactly what everyone believed her to be, a tired nurse, marginally competent, doing her job. But that wasn't the worst part. The code blue alarm screamed at 6:47 p.m., cutting through the evening shift change chaos like an arterial bleed cutting through time itself. The sound was synthetic and urgent, a wail that every medical professional in the hospital was trained to either respond to or defer to, depending on their role. Megan was 30 feet away when she heard it, walking from room 507 where she'd been checking the mute veteran's central line, confirming that the saline drip was running at the correct rate, that his vitals were stable, that his eyes were tracking her with an intensity that suggested he was watching something far more complex than a simple nurse performing routine care. She turned toward the alarm without thinking. Muscle memory. The recognition of crisis. Her feet moved toward the sound while her mind was already running through differential diagnoses, already preparing her hands for what they might need to do. The patient was crashing in the hallway outside the elevators on the 3rd floor. A post-operative cardiac bypass patient, 48 hours out from surgery, his chest wound suddenly open and weeping blood like a fountain, the arterial spray painting the wall behind him in arterial red. His surgical site had dehisced, the sutures had failed, the chest wall had split open, and everything inside him was suddenly exposed to air and infection and the inexorable pull of gravity. The surgical resident, a 3rd-year named Harrison who'd been in the OR for 6 hours that afternoon, was backing away with his hands raised, his face the color of old paper, his mouth moving without producing sound. The 2 nurses who'd been escorting the patient had frozen in place, their brains unable to process the transition from routine post-operative care to complete system failure. Megan was moving before conscious thought caught up. Before protocol. Before the part of her brain that understood she was supposed to be just a nurse, just someone marginally competent, just someone the hospital was already planning to dispose of. Her body responded to training that predated her nursing license by nearly 2 decades, training that had been written into her muscle and nerve and the pattern recognition cortex of her brain in a desert that didn't exist on official maps. She dropped to her knees in the blood pool. The floor was slick, still warm from his body heat. Her hands were inside the chest cavity in 3 seconds, assessing, knowing, reading the anatomy the way a musician reads sheet music. Pericardial tamponade. The blood was pooling in the chest, compressing the heart, preventing it from filling. The heart rate monitor showed a rhythm that was slowing, weakening, a drummer losing the beat. "I need a thoracotomy kit, now." The words came out in a command voice, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and the gathered staff responded with the reflexive jolt of people recognizing authority. But there was no thoracotomy kit being rushed from the code cart. There was no surgeon appearing with practiced speed. There was only the moment stretching thin and dangerous and the knowledge that this patient would die in the next 90 seconds without intervention. Her eye scanned the hallway and found the maintenance cart abandoned outside the linen room. The utility knife was in the toolbox, exactly where it would be. She grabbed it with her right hand while her left hand held pressure on the patient's chest. 3 incisions. That's all it took. The first one opened the skin and subcutaneous tissue. The second one split the ribs, a sound like greenwood breaking, a wet crack that made one of the nurses make a sound like a prayer. The third one opened the pericardium, and suddenly the blood could drain, the pressure could equalize, and the heart could beat again. Her hands dove into the cavity. Warm blood. The firm muscle of the heart under her palms. She began compressions, manual cardiac massage, the kind they taught in medical school but that no civilian surgeon ever really needed to perform, the kind that belonged in a different context, a different war, a different version of herself. Betadine, for to zero silk, and get me a fucking surgeon. The words came in the same command voice, and a paramedic who'd arrived with the code team, an older man with scars on his hands that matched her own, went absolutely rigid with recognition. She could feel his stare. She could feel the moment his brain was making connections, his hands frozen halfway to opening supplies because he'd just realized something impossible, something that couldn't be true, something that changed the entire composition of the moment. The patient's heart restarted. Not on its own, under her hands, responding to the direct pressure, to the manipulation of muscle and the desperate will to continue. The monitor showed a rhythm appearing. Weak. Fragile. But there. "Get him to the OR now," she said, her voice dropping back to a normal register, her hand still inside his chest, her eyes still on the work. "This needs a real surgeon." "Not me. Now." The surgical resident had found his voice again. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his words coming out small and confused. But Dr. Mercer was already pushing through the crowd, his face shifting from shock to calculation to triumph in the space of 3 heartbeats. She watched it happen, watched him recognize the opportunity, watched him assess how he could weaponize what he'd just witnessed. His hand was already on his phone. The code blue alarm didn't announce itself. It screamed. The sound split the hallway like a blade, sharp, electric, the kind of noise that turned every spine in Seattle General to ice water. Shift change chaos meant the corridors were packed, incoming nurses checking patient assignments, outgoing nurses rushing toward the parking garage, residents laughing about weekend plans they'd probably cancel. All of it stopped. The elevator door slid open on the 4th floor and a stretcher erupted from the car, orderlies running, a post-op patient's body convulsing, his chest already open from surgery that morning, and something was very wrong with the geometry of his sternum. Megan was moving before the overhead speaker finished the second code blue, Trauma Bay 4. She wasn't thinking. Thought was a luxury. Her feet found the tile, her muscle memory took over like she was back at a forward operating base instead of a civilian hospital in Texas, and the distance between the nurse's station and the patient's body closed in what felt like 2 heartbeats. The surgical resident, young, maybe 3 months out of medical school, was stumbling backward, his face the color of old bone, one hand raised as if he could push the problem away through sheer will. The patient's chest wound to hissed. That was the clinical term. What it actually meant was that his incision was separating, the stitches giving way, and arterial blood was spraying in a pattern that said the internal mammary artery had gone catastrophically wrong. Not trickling. Spraying. The kind of hemorrhage that killed in minutes if nobody moved fast enough. Megan was already there. Her hands found his chest, assessed the damage, the warmth of blood, the slick texture of exposed tissue, the irregular rhythm of a heart that was beginning to lose its electrical argument with physics. Around her, staff froze the way animals freeze when something incomprehensible is happening. The attending had his hands on his hips, shouting for a crash cart. The resident was still backing up, his mouth open. A nursing student stood frozen with a clipboard, watching like she was observing something on television. Sterile kit. Now, Megan said. Her voice had changed. Lower. Clipped. The voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. 10 seconds passed. The attending was still organizing his thoughts. The crash cart was still 3 corridors away. I said now, she repeated. Not louder. Just final. The surgical resident, the one who'd been backing away, ran. Found a kit. Fumbled it open. But he was shaking, and his hands couldn't hold precision, and the sterile field he was trying to create was collapsing like a house built in rain. Megan watched him for exactly 1 second and made the only decision available to her. She stood, her eyes scanning the hallway for what she needed, and she found it, a maintenance cart pushed into an alcove near the bathroom, the kind of cart that held supplies for small repairs and quick fixes. She reached it in 3 strides. The utility knife was where it always was, in the top drawer, red handle worn smooth from years of use. She pulled it free and the blade caught the fluorescent light like it was announcing something. Around her, the silence became absolute. The kind of silence that happens when a room collectively holds its breath. What she was about to do violated every protocol taught in civilian medicine. It violated OSHA regulations and hospital policy and the entire structure of oversight that made sure nurses stayed in their lane. What she was about to do belonged in a field hospital in Helmand Province, not in San Antonio, Texas. She knelt beside the patient. One hand pressed beside the wound, feeling for the anatomy beneath the blood. The other hand held the utility knife. Her movements had the terrible, beautiful precision of someone who had done this before, who had done this under fire, with rounds coming in, with the certainty that if she didn't crack his ribs and get to the bleeding she was watching die, he would be dead in less than 4 minutes. First cut, the thoracic wall, clean and deep, following the 4th intercostal space with the same muscle memory that made her fold bandages perfectly, that made her recognize the mute veteran was watching her with a soldier's eye. The blood flowed hotter, but opening the chest meant accessing what was bleeding. Second cut, spreading the ribs with her fingers, feeling them resist and then give, hearing the faint crack of bone giving way to necessity. Her breathing was steady. Her hands weren't shaking. This was just information, pain was information, blood was information, anatomical landmarks were just data points that led to survival or death. Third cut, the pericardium. The membrane around the heart. Open it and you could access the cardiac wound directly. The patient's blood pressure was already catastrophic. She could feel his pulse thread thin under her left hand where it pressed his neck, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that he had maybe 90 seconds of brain perfusion left before the electrical storm in his chest became permanent silence. The blade moved. The membrane opened. Her right hand went in, found the source, a stitch had failed, torn arterial wall, and without a proper graft and proper sutures he was just a timer counting down to 0. She looked at the attending. 14-gauge angiocath. Now. And get me 1 milligram epinephrine for push. Nobody moved. They were watching her the way people watch something impossible. The way soldiers watch someone do something they didn't think human hands could do. The resident was pale. The nursing student had dropped her clipboard. The attending's expression was shifting, recalibrating, and she could see the moment he understood that whatever she was doing, whatever was happening in his patient's open chest under a utility knife held by a hospital nurse, was working. The patient's heart rhythm was visible now, and it was wrong, but it was also firing, sporadic, panicked, but electrical activity instead of silence. Move. She didn't raise her voice. She just said it, and people moved like she'd activated them with a switch. The angiocath was placed. The epinephrine went in. Her hand stayed inside the chest, maintaining pressure on the arterial wall, buying time for the surgeon who was still sprinting from wherever he'd been when the chaos started. The blood was warm and slick, and it told her what she needed to know about oxygen delivery and perfusion pressure and how many more seconds this window would stay open. Dr. Mercer appeared in the hallway doorway at that exact moment. He stopped walking. His arms went to his sides. And his face, his expression shifted through something that looked like fury and then satisfaction so complete it would have been beautiful on a predator. He was seeing what he needed to see. He was watching her reveal herself through medical training that had no place in any civilian nursing credential. He was watching her hands move with the efficiency of someone who'd done this in a combat hospital, not a teaching institution. He was watching her give orders in a voice that belonged to someone accustomed to life and death decisions, not someone accustomed to taking direction from male physicians named Mercer. His phone was already in his hand. The next surgeon arrived 60 seconds later, and Megan stepped back, not away, just back, and let him assess the damage and take over the closure. The patient's vitals were climbing. O2 sat going up. Heart rate stabilizing. She stood there with blood on her scrubs and the utility knife still in her right hand, which she cleaned carefully on a sterile pad before setting it down. Her breathing was normal. Her hands were steady. Her face revealed nothing. But Dr. Mercer was already walking, phone pressed to his ear, and she could read lips well enough to see him say, "We have a situation." Then a pause. Then, "No, I'm serious. She just performed a field thoracotomy with a maintenance knife. Seattle General. The nurse I mentioned." She walked toward the break room, her scrubs heavy with blood. The door swung open and she found it empty. Someone had cleared it on purpose, or maybe everyone had just scattered when the code came through. She sat on the plastic chair that no one ever sat on, and she folded her hands in her lap and she waited. Because now he had proof. Now he had something that couldn't be talked around or explained as standard practice. Now he had a video, probably someone's phone, someone's documentation of exactly what she'd done, and he had all the leverage he needed to burn her out of every institution in Texas. The fluorescent lights hummed above her, and she listened to them hum, and she thought about the veteran in room 507 with a throat that couldn't speak and eyes that had recognized something in her that nobody else in this hospital ever could. She had exactly 3 hours before security would find her. Dr. Mercer's office door clicked shut at 11:22 p.m. The hospital had gone quiet, that particular silence that settles over surgical floors after visiting hours end, when the machines do the talking and the hallways belong to night shift and ghosts. He sat at his mahogany desk, the kind that cost more than most people's cars, and pulled up his phone. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. The code blue had rattled something loose in his composure, but only briefly. He'd spent 3 years building this infrastructure of favors and alliances. One mute nurse with field-grade medical training wasn't going to dismantle it. The first call went to Richard Sterling, board chairman, the man who'd pushed through Mercer's hiring despite the questions about his previous position in Phoenix. They played 18 holes together every other Saturday. Sterling answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep and irritation. "It's late, Henry." "I know. We have a liability situation. Shift change incident today, unauthorized procedure, clear violation of protocol." Mercer kept his voice steady, reasonable. The voice of a concerned administrator, not a man dismantling someone's life. The nurse involved, Megan O'Brien, performed an unsupervised thoracotomy in the hallway during a code. Caused contamination risk, jeopardized patient safety, undermined hospital chain of command. Silence on the other end. Then, how bad? Needs to be contained before it becomes an incident report that reaches administration. I wanted to give you the heads up before things escalate. A pause, the exact right length. The pause of a man who doesn't want to say the next part. "She's unstable. Could be a liability claim. I'm handling it, but I wanted you aware." Sterling exhaled. I'll make sure it's documented as a separation initiated by her, not by us. No severance, no unemployment fight. She won't fight. The call ended. Mercer set the phone down, checked the time, 11:53 p.m., and dialed the next number. Texas Medical Association. Dr. Patricia Valdez, investigator, woman who'd helped him bury a malpractice concern 4 years ago when his hands had shaken during a procedure and a patient had taken a fall. She owed him. People always owed him eventually. She answered on the second ring. Henry. This better be important. It is. I need you to file a preliminary complaint on a nurse. Megan O'Brien, Seattle General, San Antonio. Today she performed an unauthorized invasive procedure without supervision, contaminated sterile field, showed signs of erratic judgment under pressure. Each statement was technically true, which made them devastating. Truth bent at exactly the right angle looked like lies. I'm concerned about her licensure fitness. Can you open an investigation? Based on what documentation? I witnessed the incident. I can provide incident photos, patient charts, and testimony from multiple witnesses. All true. All useless. I'm notifying her employer tonight. Wanted to get ahead of this from a regulatory perspective. I'll open a file. Preliminary investigation. If there's merit, we proceed. Appreciate it, Patricia. The second call ended at 11:58 p.m. The third call was the most important. It had to land perfectly. Mercer pulled up the number for the Boulder Clinic, a place that had never heard of Megan O'Brien but whose staff would, for the right motivation, confirm whatever narrative he constructed. He'd done this before. The voice that answered was young, probably an intake coordinator working late. This is Dr. Henry Mercer from Seattle General in San Antonio. I'm verifying employment history for a former staff member, Megan O'Brien. She lists your clinic as previous experience. A pause. Papers shuffling. I don't show anyone by that name in our system. Not in your current system. This would be going back 3 years. Still no. Our records go back 7 years and she's not here. Mercer's voice took on the disappointed tone of an administrator trying to do the right thing. I see. That's concerning. She listed you as a reference. Did anyone from our HR department call you previously about her employment? No calls that I'm aware of. Thank you. That's helpful. If anyone does call asking about her employment, I'd recommend documenting it carefully. There may be credential fraud involved. He hung up. The narrative was set. The clinic had no record. The investigator had a file. The board was informed. By morning, Megan O'Brien's licensure would be under question, her employment would be terminated, and her references would confirm she'd fabricated her entire background. Mercer checked his watch. Midnight exactly. Security arrived at the laundry room at 12:08 a.m. 2 officers, one of them the same man who'd escorted her to disciplinary hearings before. They didn't speak to her, just gestured. The message was clear enough. Megan folded the last of her scrubs, the blue cotton that had been her armor for 14 months, her only identity in this life, and placed it in the bin with the same precision she'd used placing every other garment. Hospital corners. Military discipline. The habit of control in the face of systems designed to unmake you. She followed them up the service stairs, past the empty surgical floor, past the ICU where machines hummed their mechanical vigilance. The HR office was on the 3rd floor, fluorescent lit and windowless, the kind of room designed to make conversations feel both official and inescapable. 2 people waited inside, Patricia Chen from Human Resources, and a man in a suit Megan didn't recognize, probably legal counsel. Chen set down a file. Her face was neutral, the face of someone who'd had this conversation before and would have it again. Megan, we've received a complaint and supporting documentation regarding your employment and licensure. The details suggest credential fraud and protocol violations. Rather than pursue a formal investigation that could result in criminal charges, we're offering you an opportunity to resign voluntarily. The papers slid across the desk. Megan didn't look at them. She already knew what they said. If you resign effective immediately, we won't report this to the state nursing board, Chen continued. If you don't, we have an obligation to file a complaint with the Texas Medical Licensing Board based on the evidence we've received. Dr. Mercer has provided testimony and documentation. Megan's hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The only betrayal was her jaw or a single muscle tightening beneath the skin, and then even that stilled. You have 2 minutes to decide, the lawyer said. Resign now, this ends quietly. Refuse, and we contact the board, the state police, and the FBI. The FBI. That word landed like a physical blow. Not because they could actually prove anything, but because the threat of the investigation itself would trigger protocols. The kind of protocols that brought people looking for people who were supposed to be dead. Megan picked up the pen. Her hand didn't tremble. The hand that had held a scalpel inside a man's chest, the hand that had stitched 17 soldiers back together in a forward operating base while mortars walked closer, the hand that had learned to be invisible in plain sight, that hand signed the document in a signature that wasn't quite her real name and wasn't quite fake either. Something in between. Something that had learned to exist in the spaces where institutions didn't look. The resignation was effective immediately. The terms were clear: no severance, no unemployment assistance, no reference letters. The document also included a non-disparagement clause, a confidentiality agreement, and a clause acknowledging that she was leaving to avoid criminal investigation. In other words, guilt assumed. We'll need your ID badge, Chen said. Megan unclipped it from her scrubs and set it on the desk. She watched it sit there: Seattle General, nursing staff, employee ID for 7829, her photo from 14 months ago when she'd still believed she could do this. When she'd still believed that being useful would be enough. Your final paycheck will be mailed to the address on file, the lawyer added. Personnel will verify your exit from the building. You're not to return without written authorization from administration. The security officers were already waiting outside the office. They didn't touch her. They just gestured, the same gesture as before, the geometry of authority. She followed them down the stairs and into the parking lot. The Texas heat had finally broken. The night air carried the smell of rain coming, that particular metallic ozone that tastes like weather approaching, like systems colliding. She walked to her car without looking back at the building. Didn't look at the windows where her colleagues weren't watching. Didn't acknowledge the presence of the security cameras documenting her departure. She drove to a 24-hour laundromat 2 miles away because she couldn't go home, couldn't process this in a space that had been built as a temporary shelter anyway. The laundromat was empty except for an old man reading a newspaper at one of the vinyl chairs. Megan sat 3 rows away. The fluorescent lights hummed above industrial dryers. A washer 3 machines over made a sound like metal grinding, rhythmic and relentless. She'd been in deeper situations. She'd been in situations where the ground was trying to kill her and the people around her were people she'd trained to follow her into exactly that kind of darkness. This was different. This was watching the constructed world collapse because the person holding it together had made a single mistake, had let her hands move with memory instead of with camouflage, had revealed the thing she was supposed to hide. 3 years of perfect integration. 3 years of being just a nurse, just one more woman folding bandages and checking fours and taking shifts nobody wanted. 3 years of a social security number and a birth certificate and a nursing license that had all seemed solid until the moment they weren't. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd meant it. She genuinely wanted to save that post-op patient. The field thoracotomy hadn't been about revealing herself. It had been about not letting someone die while she was still breathing and still had hands that could do something about it. That was the dangerous part. That was how cover got blown, not through carelessness, but through integrity. Through choosing to be human when you were supposed to be a ghost. She sat in that laundromat for 2 hours, watching the machine spin, listening to the metal-on-metal grinding, and waited for her phone to ring. It didn't. The protocols didn't work that way. The people who'd erased her from existence didn't call to check in. They only called if something went catastrophically wrong, if the erasure needed to become more permanent, if she became a loose end instead of an asset. By 3 a.m., she drove back to the hospital. The employee entrance was locked at midnight. Megan used the key card she hadn't returned, the one clipped to her former badge, which sat heavy in her pocket like a stone. The hallway smelled of industrial bleach and something else, the particular sterile emptiness of a hospital after hours, when healing work paused and only machines kept watch. Her footsteps echoed on tile. 1, 2, 3, 4. The laundry bin sat in the corner of the break room where it always did, fluorescent light casting everything in that particular hospital white that made people look like ghosts of themselves. Megan pulled the blue scrubs from the bag she'd carried in, the uniform that had been her armor for 14 months. She folded them with hospital corners, the kind of precision that used to take her 3 years to unlearn after Kandahar, then one crisis to remember perfectly. Left corner folded inward. Right corner folded inward. The fabric still smelled faintly of her skin, her sweat, the antiseptic she'd scrubbed with between patients. She placed them in the bin. The last piece of normal slipped away, disappearing beneath other discarded uniforms of people who still got to be normal in the morning. She didn't move for 3 seconds. The fluorescent lights above hummed their electric song. Somewhere on the 3rd floor, a monitor beeped. Normal continued without her. Room 507 was dark except for the pale glow of a single hallway light filtering through the doorway. The mute veteran, Marcus Webb, according to his chart, though she'd never heard anyone speak his name aloud, lay in the far bed, his roommate sleeping in the near one, the blue curtain partition drawn between them. Megan had come to say goodbye the way you say goodbye to someone you've saved and can never explain why. Her hand reached for the bedside rail. She was already planning what silence would accomplish, a nod, maybe. A steady glance. Something that said she understood that recognition running both directions down a corridor of ash. His hand caught her wrist. The grip had no hesitation in it, the confidence of someone whose body still remembered its training even if his voice lived somewhere in the past tense. She didn't pull back. She didn't flinch. She simply stood there, letting him hold her like an anchor, like a call sign, like proof that someone had been watching. His ruined throat produced sound like wind through broken glass, a single word that shaped itself against all physical odds, Valkyrie. The room stopped. The monitors kept their rhythm. The 4 lines kept their slow drip. But something in the air pressure changed, the way it changed in a medevac helicopter when you realized the casualty was going to make it, or in a phi base when you understood you were about to lose something irreplaceable. Then the night nurse's phone lit up, the one she'd been using to film a birthday message for someone's daughter in Ohio. The video would catch everything in its frame, Megan standing motionless beside the bed, Marcus Webb's hand still locked around her wrist, and his roommate's sudden awakening, the Marine Corps liaison whose consciousness came online with the particular speed of someone trained to respond to crisis. The Marine sat up. His eyes, which had been half closed with sleep, snapped into focus the way they did during briefs. He'd seen something in the hallway scuttlebutt, probably, whispers about a nurse being fired for saving someone's life in a way that violated protocol in the right direction. He reached for his tablet on the nightstand. His fingers flew across the screen with the precision of someone who'd spent for years learning to move in darkness, to find what he was looking for without needing to see it. When he began to speak, his voice filled the room like a parade ground command. Not loud, measured. The kind of speech designed to carry across open ground and through defensive positions and into the hearts of people who needed to understand that something essential had just changed. Captain Megan O'Brien. Silver Star. He paused. That pause was a weapon. For actions during Operation Phantom Thunder in Helmand Province. Bronze Star with Valor. For leadership under fire. For refusing to abandon wounded personnel despite direct orders to fall back. Each sentence arrived like a door opening into a room she'd spent 14 months pretending didn't exist. The Marine's eyes moved across his tablet, reading from an official record, the kind of document that only lived in certain databases, the kind that burned when you disappeared. 16 lives saved. One firebase held alone for 11 hours. One Army colonel with a severed femoral artery, one Marine private with a chest wound to hissing. She made the call to perform emergency surgery with field supplies and the only sutures available, which was surgical thread and a trauma needle meant for something else entirely. She stabilized for soldiers with crush injuries from IED blast. She prevented a firebase Kelly massacre using nothing but a scalpel and her sidearm against insurgent infiltration through the southern perimeter. She held that position alone. 11 hours. The door burst open. Dr. Mercer's face was the color of old blood. His mouth moved around words that didn't quite form at first, something about trespassing, about restraining orders, about security. But the Marine didn't pause. His voice climbed over the interruption, not loud enough to be rude, just loud enough to be unstoppable, the way trained voices operated when they needed to be heard. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 for shrapnel. 1 for small arms fire received while conducting emergency extraction of wounded under fire. The Marine's eyes were locked on Megan's now. You were supposed to be invisible. They told you that was necessary. They told you that was the only way to stay safe, to give you a new name, a new life, to burn your records and pretend you were never Special Forces, never a surgeon, never the soldier who saved Firebase Kelly. Dr. Mercer was shouting now, his voice the texture of gravel grinding under a tire. Security! I want her removed. I want, but he stopped. His phone had just vibrated. So had the night nurse's phone. So had the Marine's tablet. 3 separate notifications arriving in the same impossible second. The video was uploading. The night nurse's birthday message, the one she'd been filming in the corner, had captured everything, the revelation, the Marine citations, Marcus Webb's hand gripping Megan's wrist like he was holding onto something that made survival mean something. And that video had taken on a life that nobody in room 507 could control anymore. Megan stood perfectly still. Her wrist remained in Marcus Webb's grip. Her breathing remained steady. Her composure remained intact the way it had remained intact through 14 months of humiliation, through the contaminated dressing change that hadn't been contaminated, through the dismissal of her expertise, through the loneliness of a break room that cleared whenever she entered. The room went so quiet you could hear the machines talking to each other, the 4 pumps' precise beeping, the monitor's steady rhythm, the ventilator's mechanical breath, the entire orchestra of medical machinery that had been background noise a moment ago and now felt like a funeral dirge. I need to go, Megan said. Her voice carried the particular flatness of someone who'd just stepped off a cliff and found solid ground on the other side of it. Get some rest. Both of you. She pulled her wrist free from Marcus Webb's grip with the gentleness of someone separating from an anchor because she finally, after 14 months, remembered how to float. She didn't run. She didn't hurry. She simply walked toward the door, past Dr. Mercer's sputtering protests, into the hallway where every monitor on the unit seemed to have turned its attention toward her. Her hidden identity wasn't hidden anymore. It was uploading at 3:42 a.m. to a video platform where it would eventually be seen by millions, where hashtags would form around her name like a constellation suddenly visible after decades of darkness. Her cover, the one they'd burned 14 months ago and told her to wear like a second skin, had just been stripped away in room 507 by a mute veteran's whisper and a Marine's recitation of facts that had been classified until 3 minutes ago. She was walking toward her true reckoning now, toward a helicopter landing before dawn, toward a general in full dress uniform with regrets and thanks in equal measure, toward the destruction of everything Dr. Mercer had built on the foundation of her invisibility. But she didn't know any of that yet. All she knew was that she was finally, after 14 months of holding everything together in absolute silence, visible. If you've ever been forced to become someone you're not just to survive, if you've ever held life in your hands and then been told to forget you were ever trained for such work, you need to see what happens next. Subscribe now. The real reckoning begins at dawn.